Welcome back, thrill seeker, to the rabbit hole. The only show where the whispers behind closed doors get told to those who listen. And tonight, we're talking about a real-life documented attempt to overthrow the United States government. The year is 1933. America is on its knees. The Great Depression is not just an economic event, it is a national trauma, a deep bleeding wound that refuses to heal. 4 years have passed since the stock market crash of 1929, and the country has spiraled into a state of despair unlike anything seen before. 1 in every 4 working Americans is unemployed. That's not just a statistic, that's a quarter of the nation with no job, no paycheck, and honestly, very little hope. Families who once knew prosperity now stand in breadlines, their pride worn thin by hunger and desperation. Banks are failing by the thousands, taking with them the life savings of ordinary people. The American dream has become a waking nightmare. Across the country, the landscape is scarred with the evidence of this collapse. In the cities, so-called Hoovervilles, shanty towns built from scrap metal, cardboard, and discarded wood, spring up in public parks and vacant lots. These are grim monuments to the failure of the system. People who once owned homes now live in squalor, named mockingly after the president they blame for their plight. In the heartland, the Dust Bowl is beginning its decade-long assault. Drought and dust storms turn fertile farms into barren wastelands, forcing families to abandon their land and join a desperate migration westward. There's a palpable sense that the very fabric of American society is tearing apart at the seams. This widespread suffering leads to a profound crisis of faith. People are losing trust not just in their political leaders, but in the entire system of capitalism and democracy itself. It seems to have failed them completely. The promises of prosperity and opportunity ring hollow when your children are hungry and your future is a blank wall of uncertainty. This is a dangerous moment. All over the world, other nations facing similar crises are turning to radical alternatives. In Italy, Mussolini's fascists are in power. In Germany, Adolf Hitler has just been appointed chancellor. The appeal of authoritarian strongmen who promise to restore order and prosperity at any cost is growing stronger. It is in this atmosphere of fear and desperation that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is inaugurated in March 1933. His famous words, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," are a direct address to the national mood of paralysis. He promises action, bold and persistent experimentation to pull the country back from the brink. For millions of Americans, his arrival in the White House feels like the last, best hope. But for a very different group of Americans, the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country, Roosevelt's promises sound less like salvation and more like a declaration of war on their world. They see him not as a savior, but as a traitor to his class. Franklin Delano Roosevelt wastes no time. In his first 100 days, he unleashes a whirlwind of legislation known as the New Deal. This is not a tweak to the system. It is a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between the government and its people. Programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps put millions of young men to work planting trees and building parks. The Public Works Administration funds the construction of massive infrastructure projects like dams, bridges, and schools. The government is suddenly and powerfully intervening in the economy, creating jobs and injecting hope where there was none. For the common person, this is a revolution of relief. The government is finally on their side. But if you are a titan of industry, a Wall Street banker, or the head of a massive corporation, you see this very differently. To you, the New Deal is not a lifeline. It is a threat to your entire way of life. You see Roosevelt as a socialist or worse, a communist, who is using the crisis to dismantle American capitalism. His policies involve higher taxes on the wealthy to pay for social programs. They involve new regulations on banks and the stock market to prevent the kind of reckless speculation that caused the crash. He is creating a social safety net, things like Social Security, that you see as an attack on the principles of self-reliance and individual success. This powerful elite, men who run the biggest companies like DuPont, J.P. Morgan and Company and Goodyear, begin to see FDR as a clear and present danger. They believe he is destroying the country by abandoning the gold standard, which they see as the bedrock of a stable economy. They are horrified by his support for labor unions, which they feel gives far too much power to workers. In their private clubs and boardrooms, the talk is dark. They call him a dictator, a demagogue who is stirring up class hatred to consolidate his own power. They feel that he is a traitor to his own privileged background, using the masses to destroy the very system that made them powerful. Their fear quickly hardens into a conviction that something must be done. This isn't just about policy disagreements, it's about survival. They believe that if Roosevelt's New Deal is allowed to continue, it will lead to the end of their fortunes, their influence, and the America they know. They are not used to being challenged. They are used to a government that serves their interests, that keeps taxes low and regulations light. Now they have a president in the White House who is actively working against them, and they are not going to sit by and let it happen. Their fear and anger begin to curdle into a dangerous secret plan. The plan that begins to take shape is audacious, treasonous, and almost unbelievable. It is a plot for a military coup d'etat. The idea is to overthrow the democratically elected government of the United States and replace President Roosevelt with a leader of their own choosing. This wasn't just idle talk over brandy and cigars. This was a concrete conspiracy organized by some of the most powerful financial and industrial figures in America. They believed that democracy had failed and that the country needed to be run more like a business. Efficiently, ruthlessly, and with power concentrated at the very top. They looked at the fascist movements in Europe not with horror, but with a kind of professional admiration for their methods. The key players behind this plot included figures linked to the highest echelons of American finance. Men like Prescott Bush, grandfather of one president and great-grandfather of another, were connected to the banks financing the operation. Executives from corporations like J.P. Morgan, DuPont, and Remington Arms were allegedly involved, providing the financial backing and ideological fervor. Their plan was to use their immense wealth to create a private army. They envisioned a force of 500,000 veterans, modeled on the fascist Cross of Fire League in France. This army would be their instrument of power, a force strong enough to intimidate the government and march on Washington. Their strategy was two-pronged. First, they would create a public relations crisis for Roosevelt. They would use their influence over the media to paint him as a failed leader whose health was collapsing under the strain of his office. They would stoke public fear and uncertainty, creating an atmosphere where a drastic change in leadership might seem necessary. The second, and more critical part of the plan was the military force. This army of veterans would be presented as a patriotic organization, but its true purpose would be to march on the Capitol, seize control of the government, and force FDR to step aside. He would be allowed to remain as a ceremonial figurehead, but the real power would be held by a new Secretary of General Affairs, a kind of business-friendly dictator appointed by the plotters. The conspirators believed they had everything they needed: the money, the influence, and the motive. They had the backing of some of the richest men in the world, men who could write a check for millions without a second thought. They believed they were patriots, saving America from a socialist takeover. To them, this wasn't treason. It was a necessary course correction to protect their vision of the country. They were confident, they were organized, and they were ready to move. They just needed one more thing: a credible and popular military leader to command their army and be the face of their coup. They had the perfect man in mind. The man they chose was Major General Smedley Butler. And, on paper, he was the perfect choice. Butler was, at the time, one of the most famous and decorated Marines in American history. He had served in conflicts all over the world, from the Boxer Rebellion in China to the so-called Banana Wars in Central America. He was a two-time recipient of the Medal of Honor, a genuine American hero. More importantly, he was incredibly popular with the troops and veterans. He was known as the Fighting Quaker and had a reputation for being tough, honest, and fiercely loyal to the men under his command. The plotters saw him as the ideal figurehead, a charismatic leader who could rally 500,000 veterans to their cause and give their coup a veneer of patriotic legitimacy. So they sent a bond salesman named Gerald McGuire to recruit him. McGuire approached Butler several times, slowly revealing the details of the plan. He told Butler that the country's most powerful businessmen were ready to finance a massive army of veterans, and they wanted him to lead it. They offered him unlimited financial backing, a powerful public relations machine to build up his image, and ultimately, a position of immense power in a new government. They tried to appeal to his ego and his patriotism, telling him that the country was failing and that he was the only man who could save it from Roosevelt's radical agenda. They believed Butler, a career military man, would share their conservative views and jump at the chance. But they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had completely misread Smedley Butler. While Butler was a fierce military man, His experiences had made him deeply suspicious of the very people who were trying to recruit him. He had come to believe that most of the wars he had fought were not for democracy or American ideals but to protect the profits of Wall Street banks and multinational corporations. He famously wrote that he had been a high-class muscle man for big business, a racketeer for capitalism. When McGuire laid out the plan to overthrow the president, Butler wasn't intrigued. He was horrified. He saw it as the ultimate betrayal of everything he had fought for. Instead of accepting their offer, Butler decided to play along. He pretended to be interested, gathering as much information as he could about who was involved and what their exact plans were. He met with McGuire several times, patiently listening as the full, treasonous scope of the conspiracy was revealed. He learned the names of the powerful financiers, the details of the military plan, and the ultimate goal of installing a fascist-style government. Smedley Butler, the man they thought would be their general, was secretly becoming their accuser. He was gathering the evidence he needed to expose the entire plot and bring it crashing down around them. In November 1934, Smedley Butler did what the plotters never imagined he would do. He went public. He took his incredible story to a congressional committee, the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, which had been formed to investigate Nazi propaganda in the United States. In sworn testimony, Butler laid out the entire conspiracy in stunning detail. He named the names. He described the meetings. He recounted Gerald McGuire's offer to make him the leader of a fascist army that would march on Washington and depose a sitting American president. He was backed up by the reporting of a journalist, Paul Comley French, who had conducted his own investigation and confirmed Butler's account. The committee was shocked. The committee's final report confirmed the core of Butler's testimony. It stated that it had received evidence that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organization in this country. The report concluded there is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. It was a bombshell. A congressional committee had just confirmed that a group of America's richest men had plotted a military coup against their own government. This should have been the biggest political scandal in American history. It should have led to arrests, trials, and a fundamental reckoning with the power of wealth in a democracy, but that is not what happened. What happened was nothing. Absolutely nothing. No one was arrested, no one was prosecuted. The powerful men Butler implicated, the titans of finance and industry, were never even called to testify before the committee. The committee redacted their names from the public version of the final report. Mainstream newspapers, many of which were owned or influenced by the very same business interests, either buried the story or dismissed it as a wild fantasy. They painted Smedley Butler, a two-time Medal of Honor recipient, as a delusional crank. The story was effectively silenced, scrubbed from the national conversation almost as quickly as it had appeared. And so, the business plot became America's forgotten coup. It is a story that is rarely, if ever, taught in our history classes. Why? Perhaps because it is a deeply uncomfortable truth. It tells us that the greatest threats to American democracy do not always come from foreign enemies or radical fringe groups. Sometimes they come from the very top of the power structure. The story of Smedley Butler and the business plot is a chilling reminder that democracy is fragile, and that there have always been powerful people who see it not as a sacred principle, but as an obstacle to their own wealth and control. It proves that sometimes the most patriotic act is not to follow orders, but to defy them. Alright, Seekers, this has been The Rabbit Hole by the Urban Rabbit. Until next time, stay strange, stay sharp, and don't forget to stay down the rabbit hole because you never know what's lurking right outside.